양도 되지 쇼게다 태좀 나 로시고 쉬로아제 태좀 세야지 랑기 유라 타니수도 베기 리바딜레 태좀세 아딜레 네 태좀지 아 아니 로시에 세야디게 아니 랑유레 친줄로도 쉬비리바 로시에 오체 스타디 디수 차상다 로시에다 태좀 차상 네 가상 쉬바나제 나라망고 로시에다 이주세야 차상 랑기 유용어디 지다와 신도 하모고와 마도와 제거를 니서 하모고지 니마세도 로다디게 있네다 너 내랑기 유용어디를 로수 근데 제 도초 진대요 와다 자디네 엔자 디수기 유니스 하모와자 디솔라티네 내가 저기라 나지 콘트라키야다 되네 녀모바키야 내 누가요야 그 규로지 직 디수 차교를 해지래
This morning, then, we looked at doubt and wrong consciousnesses, which we saw defined as doubt being a knower that wavers between two alternatives by its own power, and wrong consciousness as being a knower that engages its object erroneously. From those two definitions, it's quite clear that these two consciousnesses do not realize their object. Similarly, with the awareness we looked at last night, non-ascertaining awareness, that too, being a non-ascertaining awareness, does not realize its object. And similarly, in the previous weekend, we looked at correct assumption, which also doesn't realize its object. And so, why this is of importance is that not realizing the object, there is an element of error. There's an element of unreliability there due to the error. The degree of error greatly varies across these four consciousnesses, but it's important to remember that these objects are not realized by such consciousnesses, and therefore we need to be aware that our awareness is not entirely reliable. So when saying that there's a varying degree of distance from a realization for each of these consciousnesses, it should also be kept in mind, in particular a wrong consciousness, because not only does it not realize its object, it engages its object erroneously or in a contrary way. So it is very far from realizing its object, and therefore a far greater degree of problems and difficulties will follow from wrong consciousnesses.
대신 저 로시에들라 너도 로시에다 도메 로시 니지 다 도메 로시에데 이기 시병어기 로시에서 지다 아니 와시용어기 로시에서 네 아니 용어스 이기 시병어기 로시에데 가르차그레선 도메들라 밀람지 내가 소가지고 몸보 밀람지 내가 통해 몸보디 몸보 사와나디와 나와치 데나와들 짐바임바나데 예 이기 셰바디 아니 도메 로시에 이기 도메 이시 로시에서 디샤로 당조
When we're looking at wrong consciousnesses, we saw it has several divisions, or two divisions, namely conceptual and non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses. And the non-conceptual ones, these have two subdivisions into mental and sense. We looked at the first one, that of mental consciousnesses that are non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses. And we saw the illustration for 2.1, a dream consciousness that clearly sees as blue the blue of a dream. So this is a mental consciousness in that it's not a sense consciousness, all of which have been dormant, and it is a non-conceptual consciousness, and it is a wrong consciousness. So that we looked at briefly earlier.
디나신다 공부스나다 인가서 밀람이나서 강바 니람에서 니람에 강바 근데 강바를 SMP 다 나한테 이게 셰번 것으로 디수차사 강바래 안에 니람이나서 통하기 안에 지게 메도로다 데네 다마라 통하여 니람 다마라 통하여 봐다 데네기 밀람지 내가 통해 강바디 강방원에 나되게 나위 이게 셰바 디수에 나나 가소리 이용 shebe ngo tome ngo gyube ani gi sheba lo she de chagorwa ani ne khangba yore medo yore da de shi pero shi jibu de ngombo la ma da damara yunguru wa de de yin han bu she de ngombo sa she ro de be sha ma do da khangba yore de yin han zung ngombo she de chue shi ngombo la she ra ka dong ni le mi ya su ngombo na ngombo ge she ro da 디 배천 잠지래제 지나디 민백이 ngombo 많이 받네 매도 요래 카도 세보 요래 되네 지 강바 요래 다 말아디니기 신동라 소바데 나 요래서 왔다 디시셔디 배천 잠지 쉬바로 하지래 ngombo 세데.
Of course, it goes without saying that a dream consciousness, that is a mental consciousness, a conceptual consciousness, and a wrong consciousness, so a non-conceptual consciousness and a wrong consciousness, will have a variety of objects. The illustration here is seeing the color blue as blue, but of course it can be any one of a variety of objects, whether it's flowers or one's home, any variety of objects one can have in a dream, where the dream consciousness is a mental consciousness, a non-conceptual consciousness, and a wrong consciousness.
ngombo zimbe toba yongore toba di toba lo shere ma do yi shebare di toba lo shere ngombo di ngombo denji dan jeyu ko ne na je ani di ngombo re simbe zimbe toba yong siguro toba yongoro wa je ngombo toba yongore ne da jingla zo nilam zo ngombo ne nilam ngombo se joro ba da di ngombo de su rebe garre islam na demet jere su rebe na su re la go da ngombo di nilam ngombo de su re se gore ida nilam bine ga se ngombo na bi yi sheba do me sheba shara ba di men bi ge de nilam de ngombo na bi ngombo di jin bi ge do ba je yung gre je do ba inji da inji mi yi sheba do me ing gu ma do ba yung gre je da nilam na yi su ngombo de su re je da sheba da do ba da do me ni ge wo de yin a do me yo de je she sa ba da 디나 지금 밀람 용고 나오 진비 똑바야 용그레스 똑바 요래 인지미지 도메 셰바 짱짱 말해서 똑바 요래지 이나다 원보디 밀람 원보디 수그레베 데미지레라는 수그레라 오래지.
So we see here that a dream consciousness 2.1 is an illustration of a mental consciousness that is non-conceptual and wrong. However, it doesn't pervade that all dream consciousnesses are, for example, non-conceptual consciousnesses. There are dream consciousnesses that are conceptual, with the difference being, to a conceptual consciousness, a meaning generality appears, whereas there's no meaning generality for non-conceptual consciousness. So a dream consciousness doesn't necessarily fulfill all three of these criteria. Then to go back to the illustration about the blue that appears as blue of a dream. So is that blue? Is it form or is it a non-associated composite? Well, it would be said that it is form. And to be particular, the color blue in a dream is called a phenomena source.
da ti da ro da ra ji wang xie ge tong tu ye ge ane su ri ma wo ji de le su gi jie xie le go ro su jie xie dang ge ke xin xie de wang xie ge tong de su ra ba de dang ge wang xie ge tong ma tu ge su cha mo de ge yi ji xie ba rang ge ha go ya ma do wang xie ge tong ma tu ge su cha mo de ge la ming qu ge xie su le go re.
So what then is a phenomena source? So we heard that the dream object, whether it's the house or the flower or the color blue, this is form. It's not It's not a non-associated composite, it is form. But then we hear it is a phenomena source, which means it is not a different kind, which is a form source. So we heard it's form, but now it's saying it's not a form source. So what's the difference then between a form source and a phenomena source? Well, a form source is what is coarse form that is apprehended by our sense consciousnesses. Something that we see, something that we hear, that is, we taste, we touch, etc. This is form, it's coarse form, and it's a form source. A phenomena source is apprehended by a mental consciousness, whereas the form sources are apprehended by a sense consciousness. And and whilst a phenomena source is form, it's not coarse form, it is subtle form. So therefore, the blue of a dream, whilst form is not coarse form, so therefore it's not a form source, it's subtle form, and therefore is a phenomena source. And a phenomena source, being subtle form, is not apprehended by a sense consciousness, but by a mental consciousness.
Ni sebe negas to gorebe ni kuwe negas to gores tizan ni lam gen negas so den ngombo de ngombo na den ne wa shi sheba de lo shen la gorwa tizan de to min do was an ge di to gore sa chi nga chu ge sam do wa shi ro da ko su gi to gorwa to ya de anda ni ku ne to gorebe ni se ne to gores ni lam gen negas so de ngombo na wi gi ngombo na wi ngombo chi ores di ngombo du su re la so Dadi suginza di tobe tsema jorwa, togurwa, di gedi togures, ni kuwe negas togurbe, ni sewe negas togures, ni sewe negas tolabna, ni sesade nilam ni sesade dine subiyo marwa. Ni sede nilam subiyo marwa, nilam kono meba has nilam submerwa, ni toyo marwa jede. Dedada toya jeda ko suginza to togure, ane gedi togure sachi. Di simjure je jorwa dangzo.
When hearing then this presentation on dream consciousness, then one should have the thought, so how is this known? How is this known? So, and from this doubt, one should immediately embark on a process of analysis, of investigation. We've heard that blue is, for example, blue is form. So if it's form, surely then it is realized. But we're seeing here that a dream consciousness is given as an illustration of a wrong consciousness. And a wrong consciousness doesn't realize its object. It engages its object erroneously. So then when is the blue realized? Is it realized when we're sleeping? Was it realized when we're awake? So here we should have a number of doubts coming up.
Don dogu gore, then is go suinza, and get it over some tavena. Some tavena, Senaga Nilam Tonsa, and he says on it, Dinis Tonson said, Jayor, Tingur, but then I'll do Tingo ordering it Nilam, the net such it Medoro, the net Tonsons, and a combat the net Tonsons, Nilam Nala, Chudinator Tonson said, Nilam Nisi, the ones with Jayor, Tingur, what that. She's not Tingu Baza, Jiggy did temper Geshe Thubten Rabten Chagorwa, Geshe and the Geshe, you talk a lot of Chagorwa.
Whilst dreaming, the object's not realized. We see here that's a wrong consciousness, so it can't realize. So the object then is realized, but when we wake up. So how do we realize the object of the dream? When we are awake and no longer dreaming. So when we wake up and we recall our dream, we have a memory consciousness recalling the dream. A memory consciousness is a subsequent cognizer. Subsequent cognizers realize their object. So therefore, if the object of the dream is the color blue, a home or a flower, when we wake up and we remember the object of our dream, we realize it, but through a subsequent cognizer.
디 잼베 젠시디 지시를 와다. 제 지시인 장은 그것이 지시 라면도 지시게 챙이자도 도선도 비리바세 지시게 챙이샤로 와. 자 도선도 비리바세에 대 가능실라고 그래람나. 유지 체망아마시 도비 dob기 아니 도바 거의 도바 인자 도선도 바래스. 유지 그런 게 지시디게 강도의 그 유지 그런 일에 체망아마시 도아제 니이슈 긴토네 그런 도바 인자 아니 그 도선도 비리바라게 해스라로와. 제라자 거다 만족이 일람나디 통소세 제용도 전시디 유도요 번장 디도부 그 전시기 체망아마시 유도 도부 체망아마시 고구로 와다. 예자다지 체망아마디 간저기 대제주 당고를 가와요 그래야 돼. 요고로 와다. 네 인연이 계시면 나제 곧 지신당 곧 체망 그 전에기 체망아마지 요고로 와지. 다 요고고 인자 다 체망아마디 가와도 신행아도 집어 제고를 해지다.
Previously, when we looked at subsequent cognition, the subsequent cognizers, yes, we saw that a memory consciousness is an illustration of a subsequent cognizer. And I'm going to quickly find the page here, but you'll remember the definition of a subsequent cognizer is that which realizes what has already been realized. So a subsequent cognizer, of which memory consciousness is an illustration, realizes what has already been realized. So therefore, when we wake up and we recall the objects of our dream, and we realize it now, in that this is a memory consciousness, which is a subsequent cognizer, which realizes what has already been realized, then that poses the question, if the subsequent cognizer follows from a previous valid cognition which realized that object, when was that valid cognition generated?
당한저의 공부디인데 니람이네갑기 통해 공부디 니람이네가서 공부시 통 대니 세용도 아주 니람이네가서 다가서 게디시 니람나려야 되네 공부디시 통서 선비게 템버테시기 용으로 다디 대에게 체망아마데 가와 요래라나 다니 세위네가서 세위네가서 요래베 니 쿠위네가서 요래 체마데 가르래라도 다니 세위네가서 요래랍나 다다 디다다 차요 말 그래서 니 세되원자 니 쿠메로와 니 쿠메자 니람 토아메로와 니람 토아메나 근데 니람 이네가서 나의 숙디 샤야고라 요 말에 내가 봐서 디 전지게 체망아마디 니 세위네가서 요 말다.
The subsequent cognizer recalling the blue of the dream can only come about in dependence on a previous valid cognition of blue. So when was that valid cognition generated? It would either then be generated whilst one was sleeping and dreaming of blue, or whilst one was awake, either awake or asleep. Well, it couldn't have been whilst one's sleeping, because then one cannot see blue, because the sense consciousnesses are withdrawn. There's only a mental consciousness. So no valid cognition of blue could have been generated during sleep.
니 세위에 나가서 그 전지게 체망아마 체마데미도 다 체마데 연나다 가와서 니 구에 나가서 샨마도 샨샤사 메르와다 니 모고라 메르와다 대지 민둘랍사서 이게라서 니 모고 겁로 연나 니람 니 모고나 니람 토야 메르와다네 니람 토야면은 니람나 나위게 나 뭐야 요마르와다 대등아도 니람이네가 기식으로 와 니람이네 니 구유가 니람들이 최신 공부직 배에 가동 공부직 통으로 와다 니 세어등에 니람들이 통성세 정기로 와 디전시디 제시래제 제상 고용 공부디 니람이네가 공부도 도고 와디기 다디 공부 또 봐서 니람이네가 공부 또 비게 그 전비게 전시 체마지 고고래제 지식매제 이 니람 내가서 공부시 난거로 와 니세야도 니람나라 딘데 통성성 기시여로 와데 제가 전에데 그래서 니세 찬이 된거로 와 엉이 니람나 딘데 통성서 전에데 전시데 니세 찬에 안 기시거로 엉이 딘데 통성 결 딘데 통성서 중시거로 와 딘이 구요 말거든요 제사디 전시 제시래지 디 전비 전시디 제시래지 디기 니람지 내가 좀 온보도 또고 오래지 아니 가르도 거서 니쿠르 내가 가서 온보 난 거로 와 디또야디 니쿠르 내가 가서 니람이 셰발로 온보 나야디 또고 오래지 말 또야기 유디 셰바디 유를 가르 또고 오래지로 니람 내가 야니스네 전비 전시기 가르 또고 오래라는 니람이 내가 가서 온보 나비 온보디 또고 오래지 유디 온보디 니람이 내가 온보디 또고 오래지 해를 빼나가 저기 미기들 펴기 셰바디 또 한지 가르 또고서 펴기 또고 오래 그러와 진짜 니람이 가서 니세네 잠바께요도 전시디기 유 가르 또고 오래서 니람이 내가 가서 나야고 온보디 또고 오래지 유디 니람이 내가 가서 나야 온보디 또고 오래서 셰바디 가와 전시디 가와서 니세외 내가 가서 요래지 네 라고 써야 돼
Okay, I'll tell you what I understand. Whether it's correct or not will become clear. So when we wake up, we recall our dream. That's a subsequent cognition. So there, as the subsequent cognizer realizes the object. So that I got clearly. During the dream, not so clear. So during the dream, when you're dreaming of blue, there is an appearance of blue to the consciousness. And that is what is remembered when we wake up. And when we wake up, what we remember then is a subsequent cognizer which realizes what appeared to us during the dream. So that's as I understand it.
That's it. Nilam yado, nilam todo, nilam ya kangba tonga yore, nilam sa kangba tonga yore, ni says, oh, nilam nala kangba denes tongson se dingorwa. Di den, di nilam yene so naya ke kangba de dingorma, the kangba one dingormarwa. De jing on the ngombo kishe do, nilam nelson ngombo medo ngombo si naya do, nilam niku venes medo ngombo ninjur tongwena, ni said, oh, nilam nala medo ngombo si dene tongson se dingorwa. Chesan desu denya dige, 展示些吧的搞几个是你在菜园几个了，你在菜园样子。就是我不的我那的马路啊的，你那边那个是我那马路啊的，你那边我不是个了。就是那人家这个你那边，人家这个讲是人均收入，别那个你写的，你那哪了我不的那汤上，别那边多我不去你那哪了汤多呢？ 되네 니세동이 되네게 어디니 통성서 제야도 가르친 것은 니람이 내가 소 니람이 셰발라 나야 그 원보디 딩고래 딩원봉원에 말와 원보디 딩고래 제가 디 전시디 제시래 디기 원보디 니람이 내가 소 나야 원보디 도고래 제래 도고래 내가 니람이 원보 도고래
Okay, now clear. So when we wake up, we have a subsequent cognizer remembering blue. But the blue that we remember is not blue. It's the blue of the dream. So whilst we are dreaming, we have an appearance of blue, or we have an appearance of the house, or an appearance of the flower. It's not the real flower, house, or blue. And that is what is remembered. So the subsequent cognition, the memory consciousness, is of the object that appeared to the dream consciousness. And the object that appeared to the dream consciousness isn't the actual object, it isn't the actual blue or house or flower, but rather the appearance of a flower to the dream consciousness. And it's the appearance of the house to that dream consciousness that is remembered when one wakes up by subsequent cognition. Okay. So,
난 되게 지시디 전배 전시디 지시를 와지래. 지시인자 가르고 오세네. 코 전지게 체망아마치 고구래. 체망녀마치 고구래. 그래서 또숨 또 버리 말해지. 저선 그런 게 유디 또에기들라 마도니를 디토베 체망아마치 체마샹다시 고구래. 체마지 코 전바래스. 저선 체마 전바자 니코 전야기 체마디 니세외 내가 수요래. 니 구외 내가 수요래. 쓰는 것도 제바 제고래지. 다 제고래. 가와도
Now this subsequent cognizer, it's subsequent, so it's follows. What does it follow from? Valid cognition. So subsequent cognizer is the second and all subsequent moments of valid cognition. So therefore a subsequent cognizer has to follow a previous valid cognizer. Then we return to the question, when was the valid cognizer generated? During sleep, during dreaming, or during a waking state?
Dinigi tsema di nga zu ni sewe ne kapsu yore be lamna di yungu mare karresene ni sewe ne kapsu ni lamji su ngombo khoro yo marwa karse ni lamji ngombo se ni lamji sheba ni gi sheba na du goro nang gorwa chida ni mo go na ni gi sheba yo kho yo marwa ni gi sheba me na ni gi sheba la na yu ngombo di yong mare yo ma me za di ni ne kapsu ngombo na yu ngombo to bi ge tsema di nilam sewe ni sewe ne kapsu shebadi mereda togo ni sewe ne kapki shebadi ki nilam gi semadi kaso ngomba na de na to mere kasne ni go ro yo mara ni meba nilam gi sheba mere meba nilam gi sheba la na yu su ko ya ko yo mara se mena to yo mara de rese bene rewadi de silada bene nilam gi ne kapsu nilam gi sheba la ngomba na de ngombo di ni sewe ne kapsu yo mara 매바자 니세웨 내가 디톡베 체마미 요 말와다 그래서 유고랑 요 말, 유면에 디톡베 체마 용 말와 그래서 니람이 셰발라 옹보 나비기 나옹보디 니세웨 내가서 요 말에 매바자 니세웨 내가 디톡베 체마 요 말에 니세가서 니세서 야랑서 니호 지시거로 봐데 니세세로 봐 지시도 여러와 체마치고다 체마 집어져 지시기 진시기 체마 제고로 와서 체마데 제용도 가르치고로서는 체마디 니세위나 체마 연의 양의 왕시 체마 진고로 양의 제수법에 체마 니마도 줘서요 말와 니세위나서 코수그로와 수긴자 니세위나가 수수 니람기 내가서 니람이 셰발라 나되기 수디 니람이 셰바 코로 매반자 니람이 셰발 나외 수 니세위나서 요 말와 매반자 The
preceding valid cognition to the subsequent cognizer cannot have been generated when one wakes up. So if one wakes up and recalls the dream, in those moments between waking up and recalling the dream, in those moments, one can't give rise to a valid cognizer of the dream object, because one is no longer dreaming. So that object isn't appearing anymore. Moreover, that dream object didn't exist as form. One wasn't dreaming of the actual house, and now when one wakes up, prior to the subsequent cognition, there cannot be a valid cognizer of the house that one was dreaming of, because one is no longer dreaming, and that house doesn't exist anyway. Because the house doesn't exist anyway. So therefore, the valid cognition, independence on which a subsequent cognizer arises, cannot be generated after waking up.
이 셰발도 똑바도 도메게 도메 셰바 니여 당아서 도메게 셰바들 당고 도메게 셰바 지르와 다 도메게 셰바들라 니 셰바들 나나 데니기 이 셰바데 옴보 나위게 니기 셰바로다 니 셰 니도 고고래 니도나 디는 나라만 올라차로 가서 두고 말해라 가서는 수수기비기게 이지 온숨이 숙도바 요 말와데가 나라만 올라샤서와다 변 수수 되게 진비기 수수기 수수 되게 진비기 안에 이 셰바데 나라만 올려서 셰서와 김제 셰메데 김제 그래서 나라만 올려 랍서와 디니에 양아서 가산이 셰서와데 나라만 수수 되게 진비 수수기 수수 이원라로 수수 이원 나라만 올려라와 이기 셰바르와 똑바 마이나 당원수 가서 도메기 셰바르와 도메 셰바 있나 이중원숨 차이로와 이중원숨 인자 디기 숙디 도고 말와 진 가서 소소기베 유수침비 이용었음들라 나라만 걸로 인구그레스니 기디니엘양아 쉐살와 대단하도 제바지고라다 나라만 로레 랍사레 제가 이용었음 민나 니렘긴나 위게 수도 또 투구미 누워서다 참아 차기미 누우라고 참아 있나 그 수도베 참아 차로래 근데 수도베 참아 있나 수도베 이용었음이 참아 차기래 제가 소소기베 길로 수도베 이용었음 참아 요 말에 수 진비 이용었음 되게 세상 나라만 로레스네 아니 나중에 일 셰서래 제가 디인자 수도베 이용었음 차기미 누워서
So thus far, we've established a couple of things, that the memory consciousness that recalls the dream is a subsequent cognizer. So now we're looking at where was that valid cognizer generated on which the subsequent cognizer depends. And we just looked that it couldn't have been generated when the dreamer has woken up. So now let's look at whilst the dreamer was dreaming, was the valid cognizer generated then? So when we are asleep, we have no sense consciousnesses. So we have conceptual and non-conceptual consciousnesses as possibilities when we are asleep, not sense consciousnesses. So of the two, conceptual and non-conceptual, let's look at non-conceptual consciousnesses first. If the dream consciousness is a non-conceptual consciousness, it will be a mental direct perceiver. A mental direct perceiver, in the continuum of an ordinary being, is a non-ascertaining awareness. It doesn't realize its object. So it cannot be the valid cognizer. So again, there are two options for a dream consciousness, conceptual and non-conceptual. If it's non-conceptual, it's a mental direct perceiver. Mental direct perceivers, for ordinary beings, are non-ascertaining awarenesses. So therefore, if the dream consciousness is a non-ascertaining awareness that is a mental direct perceiver, the object cannot be realized, cannot be a valid cognition.
다 유엔나 가르고고서 제수법에 체마트마 샤야 말에 다 제수법에 체마샤나 아니 니람니 쿠두완자 딩원보레 임비 김천 삼다 제바진데 제바 체마게요 말레스 매바자데 제바 체마 차기 민두스 다 매반자다 체마디 아니 샤야라기 민두스 오르다.
Moreover, so we just saw that it can't be a valid cognizer, because if it is, it's going to be a mental direct consciousness, but these are only non-ascertaining for ordinary beings. So if it's not a valid cognizer, a direct valid cognizer, what about an inferential valid cognizer? Because there are only these two, direct valid cognizers, inferential valid cognizers. If it is an inferential valid cognizer, when we looked at this previously in its definition, it arises independence on a correct reason, which means in the dream there would have been a process of analysis based on correct reasoning that would have led to the inferential valid realization of that object. And that's not so common in our dreams. So therefore, the correct assumption when we remember the dream could not have been generated in the dream, because there's been either no direct valid cognizer or inferential valid cognizer generated in the dreaming state.
아니 제마데 아니 가리시 아니 가네스간서 니세베가 잠바 쟁기레 랍나 어다디 데데 가르쳐 버려는 라릭이 징고래 지 라릭 세치거래 당아저 니 쿠에 내가서 니 쿠에 내가서 니람 엘리다다 니엘디다 랍지 라릭이 징기래 지 데데 라릭이 징기래 다 라릭이 가네스 징기레 랍나 라릭 세야지 가르려서나 먼저기 니 쿠에 ngombo nilam gi ngombo thong de be ne ga de nilam yi sheba choro wa nilam yi sheba nyam so nyu ra ri choro es che za ni ku che ngombo thong de gi ngombo thongwi negap ki nilam gi sheba di ngombo nawe ni sheba chiyorwa di nyamso nyewe rangrik chiyores di nyamso nyewe rangre digi ane gardo gorasene nilam gi sheba do gores 지난 니람기 셰바 또 원자 아니 니람기 셰비 유디야 그런게 라릭티기 전투 마음바나 잠바 디팅고 그래서 가자 대 니세요도 당한 쪽에 잠바제에 가서는 대신 니람기 내가서 니람기 셰바 또 베냠승요 라릭티 니람기 셰바 그런 땅또 되면서 그런을 유디에 오버 나데와디 나데비 니람기 셰바디 라릭티 또 봐래 또 봐서 라릭티기 전진한 쪽 가르팅고 그래서는 아니 어디 뭐 통성화서 데니신일람 데니 통성화서 비 아니 디팅고레스 디제자 참망아마 젠세디 참망아마데 가르레라나 일레미셰 반냠소뉴가 라리디기 팅고레스 라릭디 라릭 참마데 디기 팅고레스 다 제라마와 가소렘 다데디 셈점바다 안 되게 바콘주 가서 라주 바콘주 데니시고 라주 발라서 어디 다디 딩이 어디 니시고레체 제시에 대신 공부 전에 전시치로와 제가 네 전시기 제시에 되게 참망아마게 참마데 가르샤고를 남나 니름이네 공부 니름지 셰바 냠송여가 라릭 참마지 하게래지 라릭 네 참마 라릭 참마데 네기 진거래지 참망아마지 샤고로 그 제시 인자 또는 참망아마 샤와자 이 용어스미 참마샤야메 제수법에 참마샤야메 네 참마샤야 민두와 남나 아니 ngombo nilam ni ne so ngombo nawe nilam mi sheba nyamso nyu ga rarik samadhi ki tingo res la gor khunjida
So amongst the Buddhist philosophical schools, the Chitamatrans and the Svatrantikas, they will agree that there isn't a direct valid cognizer or an inferential valid cognizing consciousness that realizes its object in the dream, but what they would say is that the subsequent cognizer that recalls the dream does so in dependence on a valid cognizer, and in particular, the self-knowing direct valid cognizer. And that self-knowing direct valid cognizer, what is it a self-knower of? The dream consciousness. Whilst dreaming then, according to Svatrantika and Chittamatra, whilst dreaming, the house appears to the dream consciousness. That dream consciousness has a self-knower. And the first moments of that self-knower is a direct valid cognizer. So that self-knowing direct valid cognizer is what leads to the later arisal of a subsequent cognizer. When one wakes up and recalls the dream, that's a subsequent cognizer, memory consciousness, which has been generated in dependence on a valid cognizer. That valid cognizer was the self-knowing direct valid cognizer, knowing its dream consciousness, knowing the dream consciousness. So that's how Chittamatrans and Svatrantikas say that one gives rise to a subsequent cognizer of a dream.
Uma tenju bagi galsan rarik sade killing go marwada. That tenju bigi kala gorsene nilam ye shebo koron la korongi range nawa ngombo nawi do ngombo nawi ge nawa se do gores. Jisa nilam shebo korongi koron la nawa do gores. Jidang koron lo she re de ne nilam ti koron nawa do gores. Nawa to wanza de jembe ka so yi sin de jen yo de ne koron la nawi ge nawa de jen yo gores. Jisa nawa koron rangi di chi gores.
Prasangika can't give the same explanation because they don't accept self-knowers. They say self-knowers are necessary because a consciousness is a knower, clear and knowing, so it knows itself. There's no need for a part that is a self-knower. And therefore, a dream consciousness, despite being a wrong consciousness, it knows itself. And therefore, the dream consciousness realizes what appears to it. The dream consciousness realizes what appears to it, and the dream consciousness knows itself. So Prasangika are saying that even a wrong consciousness, in this case the dream consciousness, is still able to realize its object, what appears to it.
다 그런 나와 두고 나와 등교 뒤에 시에메데 지도에는 건설 라야디 가리톤을 라기는 세버시 차하고로 와.
The explanation of the Vaibhashikas, this is kind of difficult to comprehend, because the Vaibhashikas, the lowest of the philosophical schools, with the course's explanation, like Prasangika, don't accept self-knowers. But their explanation, though, isn't that clear, isn't very easy to understand.
다 니람게 셰바데 아주 셰바 나네 또 셰바 차와르체 라바라바 셰바 이기 셰바 라바데 왕셰 차상가 라바 이기 셰바나 라바지 가제다 이 니람게 셰바데 셰바 참어르시레세 셰바 참어 그래서 아주 니람 통요데 아주랴 니 먹으냐네 제 장도를 제줘서도 제가 니람 통도 니람이바 니람이 내가서 니람 통도 어디 니람레서데 니람이바 하고 와지 자나 장도를 제요레스 제가 되는게 장도 제바 제리데 근데 냠렘 바디기기 저기 니람이 내가서 통비게 되는데 어디 니람이 내가서 니람이 임바디 하고네 하고데 델레 장도 제도 장바 있나 니람이 소나서 최 나는데 나 나신지 요 말에 선비게 동반이를 봐 자세 아니 곰자다 되는게 니람이 내가서 곰자 무레세 지고 난주바 냠렘 바디기라 되는 용 두고여서 와다 나서 때가 보러와 난줘봐 안 나죠 이긴 니긴 날줘 세우나 민다도 니긴 날줘 레고로 니 날줘 장바라 거와
Over these many months looking at Lorig, what should be abundantly clear is there's a wide variety amongst consciousnesses, not just in terms of division, but also in terms of subtlety. So we have our coarser consciousnesses, those which are slightly subtler, and then progressing in varying degrees of subtlety. Dream consciousness, this is included amongst subtle consciousnesses, not a particularly coarse one. So practitioners who are quite developed, they will put energy into training themselves in their waking state to recognize their dreams as such, to recognize their dreams as dreams. And the purpose of doing this isn't just to be aware that whilst one is dreaming that these are dreams, but to take the meditations on emptiness that those yogis have been engaging in during the waking state and continue those meditations in the dream state, in that through recognizing whilst dreaming that they are dreaming, the yogi will then recognize that the objects that are appearing to them in their dream do not exist in the way that they appear. And in this way, they deepen their realization or their understanding of emptiness. And this is what's meant by dream yoga.
다 된다라 다 먼저디 왕시즈 유베 이세바 록시디나 다 대주듬데레 다 알레도 혼자사 되지디다 혼자 닐람네 네베 간사디 왕시디 왕시 된뒤 세데 대제 닐람 예네가 송고모나 밀람네 네베 간사디 용어 왕시 된뒤 인제 왕시 된뒤 노 다 닐람이네 니쿠지 닐람이네 지 매도이나 공부지 매도 나뒤 공부 닐람지 쿠고로와 근데 이 쿠르게 닐람이 셰바데 오네시 이기 셰바데 니 쿠르베네 되게 네되 가사 그런 거 왕시로 차돼 그래지 왕시 왕수게 나지 미 통화나시 그런 거 미 통화나지 차돼 그래지 이내데 왕시래요 말에 그런 거 왕시로 차고 그래지.
So our dream consciousnesses, these are mental consciousnesses. However, whilst dreaming, we will not be aware that this is actually a mental consciousness because we are perceiving objects. Usually we are seeing things. So we'll think we're likely to assume that it is a sense consciousness, an I sense consciousness, although it actually isn't the case. It's a mental consciousness. And this is presented near the bottom of page 14. Underneath the illustrations or between them. However, we say that for the person who is dreaming, that dream consciousness that clearly sees the blue of a dream as blue, is a factually concordant sense consciousness. And again, the meaning is, whilst we can call it a factually concordant sense consciousness, we should remember it is not a sense consciousness. It just appears to the dreamer as such. The dream consciousness is a mental consciousness. Moving on from dreams, we come to illustrations 2.2. So we'll see that this is sense consciousnesses that are non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses. So now, not mental, but sense consciousnesses. And here, nothing more to do with dreams. A sense consciousness which sees snow mountains as blue, or a sense consciousness that sees a white conch as yellow.
That is 저기 람상 안저 하고 두고로 와 benek dung serba nai wangshe lokshe no chu yimba da ane garing mo ban wangshe de ye lokshe yimba no chu yimba de anzo sebu ha고 두고로 와 람상 ne nilam ni ne ga so de ne ge thoya de ge ane anzo nilam mi sheba de lokshe yimba de ane sebu ha고 두고로 와 nilam ni ne ga so de ne ge 제가 de ne ge le la de ge du she da don da zo de ji sho ge sheba na shin a 주기다 나 주게 가르침 거라서네 두 진마티는 아 디록셰레 제가 디네 장아서 체델이야 나주기 지게 유유 동화들라 동화의 유유 동화 잡아두지 동화시대 가서 하고야 동화디 가라 하고 그러서네 동화 세대 초와 동화 잡고 봐디 동화 임바 하고 디 동화 세야 탑람다 아니 지 배주야 주기 제투고 지고레스 강한저 가라 하고 말았으네 유유 동화디 배 띵기 대화로 디진디고 그랬어 다디 록셰레 소르다 규 동화데 세디게 빼네 되기 가서래 대화디 아니 저기 디규 동화에 가서 다데 내가 대화이네 가슴질이 규데 동화래 진짜 규 동화래 그 대화 템포 매바레스 진짜 나 저기 가슴 되니기 대화 빼 템포 딱과로 진고레스 디진네 로셰레스 차고래 디나시앙 아주 캬와두지 동화세 된 아주 풍보디 땅 아주 동화임 하고 막 그디 나 저기 디 안에 동화 하모와체 안에 동화 섬고 말에 진짜 동화에 맞다와지 아주 다 진바디다 로셰를 차고와 진짜 데네자디 디 하모와 된 아주 로셰 차고 진짜 디소 차사 삼나다디 노트레스 진짜 우이니스도 하고요 말에서 돈다 디수기 마베 데네 시에제 돈달마 데네 말리고다 티야디 데네 마티제 제가 디는상 유유 동화디 대왕원에 말에 대화 딱 받템부 대화 말 규어줘야 돼 계지기 규어줘야 남서 동화 오줘야 마도 규어기네 말에 대화 템부디 말에다 제가 디장장기 돈달 베주시네 제대로에나 줄이 땡기 대화 톱투 말에스 제가 디인상한테 땡기 대화 토비알라 삼당고래서 어두스지는 아주게다 남냠len 제야리야 두스지는야 치고어데 디기
These kinds of illustrations given here, 2.2, these and what we experience, we can quite easily know them to be, or recognize them to be wrong consciousnesses. Similarly, with dream consciousnesses, we can readily recognize that what we experience in a dream wasn't experienced anywhere other than a dream, even though we believed it to be such at the time. The purpose then of looking at wrong consciousnesses, just like all these other divisions that we've looked at, we're studying Buddhist psychology so as to understand our own inner workings much better. And the purpose of doing that is so that we can start to turn away from the habitual patterns that keep us trapped in the suffering realms of samsara, and rather develop the virtuous patterns that will lead us towards liberation from suffering. So if we think then of the threefold division of suffering. So we have firstly the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and thirdly, all-pervasive suffering. So that first division, the suffering of physical and mental pain, this is much easier to understand because it's any suffering feeling that we experience falls into this category. So that whilst there will be degrees of subtlety, and we won't readily recognize them all as suffering, this is what falls into the first degree, the first type of suffering. The feeling or sensation of unpleasantness or suffering that we experience, that falls into this first division of suffering. And that's easier to recognize. What is much more difficult to recognize is the second division, which is the suffering of transient happiness. Transient happiness is normal worldly pleasure. And this is experienced as the feeling or the sensation of happiness or pleasantness. So when a pleasant sensation arises, this is what we consider to be happiness, but is classified as the suffering of transient happiness or the suffering of change. And it's classified as suffering because it's not reliable, it's not stable, it's happiness that will fade and be replaced by more longing and craving, will be replaced by the suffering or the suffering of transient, the suffering of mental and physical pain. So where our presentation here of wrong consciousness comes in, it's the mistake that we as ordinary beings keep making, is we desire transient happiness, temporary happiness, and we desire it because we believe it to be lasting and stable. We believe that this is something worthy of striving because when it's achieved, happiness, our long for happiness has been achieved. And this is a wrong consciousness. This is a wrong consciousness. This belief that worldly happiness, transient happiness, will actually be lasting and stable. So here we can see through this illustration the importance of understanding Buddhist psychology and then applying it to our Lamaram meditations and our Lamaram studies. And in this way, we will have a greater force of knowledge behind us, turning us away from acting in a way that is not in accordance with reality. And this is important because as long as we remain under the influence, in fact controlled by wrong consciousnesses such as believing that worldly happiness is worthy of striving for, liberation from suffering will not be possible.
Langboche Toya, that Simjan Damara Toyoro, Nilamis. Jesa Nilamin also Langboche, Nilamis Nangor, the inner Langboche now on Nation, Dondala Langboche said, Yomares, Nilamias, now on Nation Langboche Mares. Jesanti, now Lolia, Langboche Winnie, but Nangor, the Nilamias, Winnie, but Nangor, the Jebachena, the Langboche, the Toya Yomar, Jesa Nilamishable, now at some mato, Corong Winnie, Winera Langboche, Yoribes and the Yomares. Now, Nashi Yomares. Dinashi, Ranzula, said the answer now, you do current sometimes said some said sometimes said Gala Mato about you don't Gala Mato Corong when you do Nangores. Chesa now on Nashin Yomar, Nilamgi, now begin Lamboch Nazi, said Bechache, the Nilami, Belia Charge and Dusine, Bemahuchan shared as a dame about to be Tombani, some Tanhalia, and this big Google. The nigger some Tavana and Dusine as a Tombani Jebachialia, how could I lie on what is it?
Furthermore, in the context of our unconsciousnesses, we've used the illustration of dreams. And this is something that in our reflections on emptiness or on selflessness that we can utilize as well. Because when we wake up and we recall our dream, in our dream we saw certain things, we experienced certain things. They appeared in a particular way. We believed them to exist in that way, and further emotions and so forth arose in the dream due to believing that what we saw existed in the way that it appeared. Now that we wake up, we immediately know that was a wrong consciousness, and the basis for whatever emotions arose in the dream is gone. If we dreamt of an elephant and maybe we were very excited, or we're quite fearful of the elephant, that is gone when we wake up, because we know there was no elephant in the room. So we then very easily can understand that what appeared to our dream consciousness was only an appearance, was merely an appearance, but it didn't exist in the way that it appeared. And it's that understanding that we then apply to our meditation. In our meditation, whatever object we're investigating, usually it's a self, how does the self appear? It appears as if it's independent, so not influenced by anything at all, and unchanging. And then we need to investigate it in the same way as we investigate a dream. Does it exist in the way that it appears? And then we come to the same conclusion. It appears in a certain way. We habitually believe that it exists in the way that it appears. But when we investigate, it cannot be found. Cannot be found to exist in the way that it appears. So the self then is dreamlike in the sense that it's as illusory as the objects that appear to our dream consciousness.
Nugin Chimbokanga Teska, John Shure, Mindu, Karangobana, Loshi, Mayimba, Loshi Imba, Hawache, Konodri Mahawane, Kari the Gawarias, Hawayama, Tamato, these are Machin Pando came, the Karangobana, washes the Loshi message, Jabacho, Kevasco, Miduas and Beza. That Rivonga Gola, Rajo Yomar said, Rivonga Red Zimbi, Washid, Kazimbulo, the top of the Loshi is. The Loshi mean Jabas in the Karapando, Rivongola, Rajo Yoba. Meba Hagone, Capson Raya, Digile Pandoya Mindu, Togo Lotoya Pandoya Mindu, Carapandayores. I Rivongola Rajo, Yores and be Zimbadi, Manzukil Yena, Carajon Raya, and the Togo Tony Gonraya Mindu, Damianda Gonraya Mindu, Carajon, Dishi and Carapandayors and begin, that's this ocean and Carapandayors, some Yon.
It's always important to bear in mind why we study Lorig, because without keeping that in mind, there's going to be very little interest to sit through the classes on non-ascertaining awarenesses, doubt, wrong consciousnesses, because it's it's very easy to walk out of here and say, yeah, so now I understand that a snow mountain doesn't exist as blue, and therefore I've realized it's white. Fantastic. Or to realize that whilst the ears of a rabbit may appear as horns, rabbits don't have horns. How useful. Wrong consciousness, I accept that those are wrong consciousnesses, but what's the harm? They really don't matter.
Bendigo Lodige, Chitan Loshere, no tourists. Chitan Bendigo Lodig, Bendigo Gola Rajas, Yoras and Big Toy, Amsa, nine to Anzuki, Open Rajo do some Jisambaina, Mishana Shasa Rajo do Rajo, Sena no to Charwa, Zuma Chagua, Chisan, do no tourists. Chisan Deniza, this Loshere, Chisan di Loshe and some Zimbana, Shinjoma, no to Chadu, Resat, Tisha do, Ndan Anzuki, Yamlinja, like Harjawas, and Be Dinashi, Ndan Anzuki Lamsa. Michile, Gyunji, Sosolia, Gyunji, Nang doing the Lamsa, Nanzuki Gyunji Siguro, what did she need? Said. Dijana Digmarella or Jessa, Mazula, Nang, the Lamsang, Lolia, Nang, do Peggy the Ina, Mimbi, Tata, Imbi, never Yomar, that's been Rivongola, Rajo, the Yomar, the Anzul Rajo, Nanguduas. Now Anashin, Rivongola, Rajo, your bed, Conchimbo Ragres, and Song Jagin Sambana, the Yon Raya Yomar was Riomares, now Anashi Yomares. Nilam Yeneraso, and then Benet, Garimbo Nang, Gombo Nang, now Anashi Mintuas. She's a Nang, the Garimbo Nang, a Garimbo Reda, says, Cotache, but then Juvena, no true was. She's a dinajing Azul, Michanda, so stucci them. Gyundoji, Sosole, Nang, but Lamsantilia, Gyundu, Sinpa Gyunji, Conro Laya, Lamsanti should Jigio Mares. That now, now, Shinji. 간데 두아 민두아 간데 이나 셈비 제바제 고주 고래라 다 제바제 고래스 고 나와나 신지 나와나 신지간에 교연지 난거변에 미디 노트리 제바 난거변에 단나도 노트리 제바데 고 간데 제샤 제비 김제 가르스 고 심주러 제고마다 남산 나요데네 하와 콜레야 교연디도 지지도 세 카다야다 안네 남산 투부 자쳐셔다 안디제네 안 노트리 침마 차그래 용신 노트리여데 제자 데네자 남산 나요데네 로디 양나 로셰 차고 양나 나라메 바 용식이 양네 태좀 용식 제 제산 디니치네 남사들의 균죄지야다 양네 지 콘라야다 지네 지고 말에 삼제 남사 소소게 나나이도 오다 이디디나 스타디나 라망베이나 다가리 로셰나 가리나 다다요면 남상에 될 균죄지네 지금 말에 삼제 아니 고 당보들야 디니기 심주제에게 탑시제고래서 제상 탑시제에 되는 세부도 하고 그래서 제상 남상 먼저 냠을래 자 남상 로를 나세 탐제 남상 어디 약보시나 어배 약보래서 남상 가초셔제하다 균진나데 배 독자래셔서 남상 독초셔제 디지교 말을 르르르제 나연의 남상 될에 맞지 또 심주제 삼로 약보 다 르르르제 또 십자하지 삼당고 그래제다 도스지 제고래서 그러다
There's a particular sequence here. The text is presented through a number of easy to understand illustrations, the snow mountain appearing as blue and so forth. The purpose of presenting these illustrations is so that the student can understand the concept well. Then, having understood the concept, then there's an onus of responsibility on each individual student. Then the student needs to take this basis that they have, this understanding that they had, and deepen it within themselves, whether it's through discussion and debate or through further reading and meditation. Because if one just leaves one's knowledge on a superficial level, then very good, there's some imprints that have been gained, but that's all. Transformation is not going to come if knowledge is left at a superficial level. Rather, we need to use all this information we're gathering here in Lorig to get to know our psychology better. Come to see our mental processes and our way of thinking. So, for example, having heard about our non-ascertaining awarenesses, previously subsequent correct assumptions, and now this time non-ascertaining awarenesses as well as doubt and wrong consciousnesses, we should all have some understanding of what these are. Now, we need to see how common they are to us. Do they arise very infrequently? Are they rare and largely unknown within our consciousness? Or do they arise regularly? Moreover, the things that we believe that we have realized, that we have understood correctly and mistakenly, is that really the case? So things that we think we have direct perception of or inferential valid cognition of, do we really have that? So we have some explanation now of all seven of these, of the minds of Lorig, the awarenesses and knowers. If you take this knowledge and investigate for yourself, hopefully it will start to become clear how many wrong consciousnesses we have, how many correct assumptions, how many non-ascertaining awarenesses and doubts we have. These consciousnesses which do not realize their object, consciousnesses which to varying degrees have flaws in them. And this is important. And this can be seen quite clearly with the presentation here on wrong consciousnesses. Because whilst we're believing in something that doesn't exist, for us this is really true. We believe in that. In the dream we believe what we are dreaming. At other times if we're seeing something as a wrong visual consciousness, we believe that what we're seeing is correct. So we need to start to gain further familiarity that more of our of our beliefs are mistaken or even wrong. And as we gain greater clarity of this, it will have more of an impact on how we live our life and interact with others. Because when we see how pervasive these mistaken consciousnesses are, and how many consciousnesses we thought were unmistaken actually are not so, we will then start not to grasp so strongly that things exist in the way that they appear. And this is important on many levels. So if we think of whether it's a view or a person or an object that we really like, a view we agree with, an object we desire, a person that we really like, or the converse, a view we strongly disagree with, or a person we dislike, or an object that repels us. If we're starting to doubt things a little bit more, if we're starting to be not so certain in our perceptions, in our conceptions, we won't be so drawn into things, believing that that things exist in the way that they appear, that they are bad from or good from their own side, that they are so desirable that I need them, that this is so offensive that it repels me. We'll start to be much more balanced in our approach, in our interactions with others, in our reflection on philosophy or views, and engagement with other types of objects. We will no longer be so deceived by desire for something, or so strongly repelled by something, but have a far more balanced approach. So to get to that point, the knowledge of Buddhist psychology helps tremendously with coming to understand that things do not exist in the way that they appear. People we like or dislike aren't pervaded by existing in the way that they appear. We thereby start to loosen this tight grasping that currently still dominates us, sir.
Sem dinechin the Zimana Karachagre, dinechin Karachagro, the dinechin the Lokshere, dinechin the Nalamanga Balagre, dinel and the Tesum Lagre said, Da Mara Sheshe pass similar pie Shimjushin to Gorva, Benanzo Sendi Bada Jibare, Sendi Big Zoo you told a Jebachine, Lamsanji Tono, Sendi Bajabachigan, Lamsan Tone, G in the whole Tona, Bene Major Chick Nazil Pingus and Lamsan. 팽규에서 20신 찬 지고마라 지고 찜주지 심주지 가르 팽규도 델판네 가파줘야 될 가르 뉴도 수쇼라 가르 뉴도 차상래 심주지 지지 심주지 파 제바제 강삼 질려 제바체는 담에 타줄래도 되네 디레사 사지마 캡라제데 디용고로 마도 남사 인조로 야도호 통해도 야보레샤사다 안지 되스 유엔로 통해도 어디연레샤세 레고마 남산데 제바디 간데나 제바 망고 지고로 와다 어디나시 저게 남바 상지 비기 지가세 천지 비기 죽툴라 제바치도 간섬 제바치 능위니 수데 세부자 하고도 되는 원에다 하고도 된 디도네 레가로 제베네 그 노트메 바다 따따로 가르 미유 가리나 디따따 주투와 용고로 와 어디나시래 아주 남바 상지 비기 다 심기 통에 조 수다 심기 나는 조낭 심기 통에 제바치 가르스네 디기 주비아디 치용어보다 낭 심기 나네 남 생기 통에 주비기 디기 주비아디 슈체다 주비아 레라 용고래 그래서 나심나 마템 비기 응어베데네 디기디 푼소바디 주투고 메레 따다 디니 장아주 나이 셈레들 제바제다 지자 제바제 남사 지 인도 허나이데 어디레샤사 타지겨 말레스 지나 디 로릭텔 망고도 수요르다 디네딘 디시 테솜라 디 록셰레 디스 노트리에세 디스 이주레 디소 원에디 노 코리 짐바나신 노메나야 코니네 또요 말고 지마 또바 인자 따다 차기 말레스 당원에 하고가 내가르스는 체마체디레스 체마다 지시세레 디나게 체마세다데 제수법에 체마다 오숨 체마 디나데다 제수법에 체마들 교여를 가서 던진난 거래 그 도고 디네 걸 교연 짜자원이 메어 말에 걸 교여레스 가서 그 던진난 거래스 제가 추려레스 다 디네기 검제데 마야야를 제바치는 그 나중 오숨이 체마스 오숨 체마 차이도 나중 오숨이 체마 차이도 디나중 오숨 체마들라다 교여 말에 다디 참아 원에 단에 야고 휴지 뿌이다고 저서 디기 지수 장지 가르체베네 도나 죽투고래 세지 땅아도도 전에 참매고 시에네 참아 야야신 안 딜레 나중에서 곰 디니 강섬 질레 남편세 차용래 저서 남편세 차다 디고네요 마다 다도 봐래 세지 디니기 시에는 죽어로 봐 저서 디니 장아서 나 상기 비기 다 로릭 마 체고 김쟁 가르스네 천리비 수를 제바 나시 마 셈리아 또 수수리 그데가르도 튜엔가르도 차산도 제바 제탄 시고로 봐
The approach we need to take is the approach that you will take in your own life, and it's taken by most people in their lives. In that, take for example the worlds of research, scientific research, or development of technology. What doesn't happen is someone has a great idea. Oh, there's an illness. This is the vaccine. No vaccine is created in that way. No medicine is created in that way. Rather, there is a thought, and based on that, a lot of research is done over a lengthy period, coming to see whether the initial idea was correct or not, and refining that initial idea until the researchers come to a conclusion that is reliable, that is correct, that is in accordance with reality. And that technique, that approach, is the same that we as Buddhists need to take. The only difference is we focus on the inner world rather than the outer world. Here then, we have a vast store of knowledge now that's been imparted about the sevenfold division of consciousness. And we need to gain some familiarity with this and apply it to ourselves continuously. Coming to know ourselves better, understanding that we have more wrong consciousnesses than we realize, and that doubt serves a purpose, but doubt can go in the direction of a wrong consciousness, but it can also go in the direction of wisdom. So we need to be clear. We have non-ascertaining awarenesses, and we have correct assumptions, and correct assumptions are useful, but this is mainly what we have in our Dharma topics, and they don't on their own lead to much of a transformation. Therefore, we have to go deeper. We have to go deeper. And we need to take these correct assumptions, keep on reflecting on the basis of reasoning, just like a scientist or a researcher investigating their topic of research will go to ever more sources to gain more knowledge and thereby have a deeper understanding. This is what we need to do, gather knowledge and reflect on that, so that we come to the point where we give rise to an inferential valid cognizer, independent, correct reasoning. And that's when we realize an object. And thereafter we'll have subsequent cognizers of whatever it is we've realized. And these have the transformative effect that we long for. But even then, we need to go deeper, because an inferential valid cognizer has a flaw. We haven't realized the object directly yet. It is still combined with the meaning generality. Therefore, even if we give rise to inferential valid cognition, we still need to meditate until we give rise to a direct valid cognizer where the meaning generality is removed and we have direct perception of the object. But still then, we can develop and need to develop further until the state of omniscience is achieved, because that is when the consciousness or the continuum is developed to a point of perfection. So the omniscient state is the objective. To get there, though, we need to now investigate our way of thinking, investigate our mental process, and start to trust a little less of what appears to our mind, gaining further certainty that phenomena do not exist in the way that they appear to us. Whether that phenomenon is a person, a particular point of view, an object, a material object, it doesn't exist in the way that it appears to us. And when we're gaining, to the degree that we gain certainty of that, our grasping at the objects will weaken. And that gives us more space. We start to see things as being less desirable, that we have to have them, or we have to be separated from them. And our mind starts to relax and become more spacious. So this is how I hope that you utilize the knowledge that's found here in Lorig, and as mentioned earlier, combine it with your Lamrim meditations.
당한 질마로도 고 나라망을 중샤 다고로 노트 중샤 나라망을 로지 계사래 지자 나라망을 로이 제소자나 노트 연구래다 미데레데 카메 스닝제사고 로 노트지 코 유래 계제 니기 견제바래 선비게 다델이야 아주 그파 잠제 고미하다 쇠빈냠을 제야기 델자야다 안디 멤비게다 로로셰로 끼는 아주 지게 마제베네 아주 지게 제샤스베 그런 거 당한 저기 잘라 메도 나중에 꼬면은 꼬송 삼비게 다 삼로 줘라 봐. 다 로셰르와 진짜 되니게 삼다지 교육임에도 꼬래 지지신 역라 셰베네. 당아주도 냠는 돌아 자요도 아니 그런래 아주 남사 아주 냠는 돌 맞아는 이 꼬면서 남사 쪼라지 콘라인 거와 진짜 되니 삼던 오다디 이 꼬면도 그런 게 되는 로셰 계셔. 다 그 로셰레 진짜 로셰 계자 로셰자 노트 차례 then 미코론라 데 닝제 카메다 코 노트 샤샤 심비게 달야 아주 세비고 코미하다 내가 진 잠니지게야 이게 다 세비고 코미스데 나야지 그 구마 차샤스도 옹에 차인라고 해야 말바다 지 될야 세비고 코미스데 파 코로 말아 봐체 그래서 코로 말아 김제 가려서 콜론 로셰지 컬기를 기에도 와서 진짜 로셰게 상황도 송와다 미들에 가요 말해서 그 세비고 코미하다 잠진이제 코미야 안 뒤도 내가 저게 나는 아주 맞아비 김제 내 자체시야다 세우시야데 상모시야데 디 연구도 지금 소수 냠는 자요도 소수 규라 현기 규기 나 로도나 나라망아 바다 태좀다 로시에 원기 소수를 균제 제바다 되는 요번에 남산디 오달로 노트기 원고 송화에 섬지될이야 잠재 고미하다 안에 서버 고미하기 냠는도 자야다 다 소소 규라 되는 게반 오다 남산 디기 치수라나 론노르 지지가 말간이나 제바 지역을 심주 지역을 섬비기 제바 제야다 심주 지야리야 엠비지 지역에 어두 차고를 당한 섬다나디 되는 섬당고 걸 당한 넘긴데 레가로시나 레 민염도 계시야다로 지도에다 연구로 왔다 아주 되네 라는 따고야 되는 따고 이내 당한서 그도 용하고 지기도 와 이내 당한서 녀래나 장아주 되니게 많이 녀래나 두스 제다서 베셈이야 장도를 지역에 되게 침무 차기스러워 다 장도를 제바이나 아니 그도 될 되는 중소배나 남사 디 라는 따투 차기로 와
I hope now it's the purpose of studying Lorig is clear, and the importance that it will have on the impact it can have on your practice. And if you do train in this, and training in this in coming to know ourselves well doesn't come easily, it takes time. But if you do so, you'll start to see signs of success. Firstly, on the meditation chair or cushion, you'll start to see yourself getting to understand your mental processes better, developing more virtuous minds, weakening the non-virtuous minds. And thereafter, you'll start to see yourself as being, as what you're meditating on, as having an impact on your daily behavior. In particular, your interactions with other people, and your interactions with your surroundings and life's events. And you'll start to see you no longer reacting in the same way. Grasping mind is weaker. The wisdom mind is stronger. So for example, if you go to the botanical garden and you pick a flower because it's very beautiful, and then you get scolded and someone says you shouldn't be picking flowers here. There's many signs everywhere, don't pick the flowers. If you've trained well, within yourself, you'll immediately recognize, oh, I had a non-ascertaining awareness. I picked a flower without thinking. I just did it. I know I'm not supposed to. The signs are everywhere. The person is correct. Silly me. So that's a very different response. There's no pride arising, therefore there's no anger arising. And immediately, with sincerity and humility, you can apologize to the person and you won't do it again. So that's not always how people respond. But if one has trained oneself well, one will not be grasping. One won't take it as a personal insult or see that there's a self-existent self to defend, but one will recognize one's mistake and apologize. Or similarly, if you're in the park and you're being scolded for picking a flower, but you know you didn't pick the flower, you bought it in the shop and you're carrying it in your hand, and so you know you didn't pick a flower and you're being falsely accused. If you've trained well, there'll be no need to get defensive, because who are you defending? What self-existent self needs defending? Moreover, you'll understand this person before you is under the control of wrong consciousnesses. They have perhaps mistakenly or erroneously seen you picking a flower you never picked. Or moreover, they are someone who's angry right now. Anger is a wrong consciousness. Having trained well, you now not getting offended at being wrongly accused of something, and therefore, with this mental space and clarity, readily compassion will arise for this person, knowing that they are under the control of a wrong consciousness, as well as the affliction of anger. Compassion will arise for them, patience will arise for the situation, thereby enabling you to respond in a loving way, in a kind way, diffusing the situation and being of benefit to the suffering being before you. So signs like this will come, but they come about independent on training repeatedly over a sustained period. First, through hearing and reflecting, repeatedly over a sustained period, change comes in our meditations, and then slowly, ever more, in between sessions. And this way, we start to transform our way of thinking, developing an ever wider and more expansive mind, and an outlook that is not just on worldly happiness and pleasures, but thinking about real Dharma goals that we need to achieve. We'll conclude for this weekend here, and then we'll commence next time on page 15. And on page 15 there's a threefold division which goes over a few pages, looking at conceptual consciousnesses or thought in some detail. And thereafter, on page 19 I think, on page 19 we then come to the last major outline, which is that on main minds and mental factors, which was briefly alluded to this morning. So thank you. We'll finish there then for now. Thank you.